So welcome to the Fish Files. This is going to be a very brief episode about one fish, one of my favorite plecos, which is called the Pterygoplichthys scrophus. It's also one of my favorite scientific names. So it doesn't have an L number like nearly every other pleco. This one was already scientifically named and all defined by a guy named Bleeker back in the late 1800s, who was a very, very famous ichthyologist who's named all kinds of species in our trade. He came up with a really cool scientific name because of the way this fish appears. Rather than hold you in suspense, let me put the fish in our little display tank and I can explain where that name came from. Now you can see what I'm talking about. Pterygoplichthys scrophus is named that way because the first part of the name, pteri, stands for wing. That's why pterodactyl dinosaurs are called pterodactyls, the ones that fly around with the big wings. This thing has a dorsal fin that looks like a giant wing. And also, hoplo, that's the oplichthys, the op part of it, stands for weapon, because it also has two horns that look like rhino horns. So Pterygoplichthys scrophus is named for winged weapons. The ichthys just stands for fish. So Bleeker didn't get too imaginative there, but I thought that was a really cool scientific name and worth spending a minute of your time on. Scrophus, I don't know where he came up with that part of the name. I don't know what was going through his head. I know it usually stands for the specific species name, Scrophus, but I tried to look it up. We even did a Google search. So if any of you guys know what Scrophus means, let us know in the comment section of the Fish Files. These are fresh from a Florida pond. Around here, we usually call them Rhino Plecos because the rhino comes from, if you look at his eyes, he has two hoods that poke straight up in the air like horns. That's where the rhino comes from. Alligator, because of its coloration, rhino's cooler. It's also called a chocolate pleco. But if you have your choice between alligator, rhino, and chocolate, I mean, what are you going to choose? So I don't hear anyone referring to this species in real life as chocolate. I only see that in the literature on the net. This is a very easy fish to recognize when you see it. I don't know why there's some confusion when you look at Planet Catfish and some of the other really nice blogs out there. There's some Reddit strings on, is this a Rhino Pleco or is this a sailfin pleco? I brought a Trinidad and a sailfin pleco here to show you how different they really are. But let me put another Rhino Pleco in here that we've had for a bit of time that's healed up. This one came from Florida, like I said. There are some mosquito fish in the pond, it looks like, which is a problem when you get fish from Florida. Mosquito fish, they don't kill fish, but they like to pick away at their fins. They look like harmless gambusia is the scientific name for them. And they do eat mosquitoes if you want to introduce them to your pond, but they are fin nippers. They've torn up this guy's fins. It's harmless, he'll heal up, but it takes a couple weeks for those fins to get back. And so besides the large dorsal fin, which causes some confusion with sailfin plecos, you always have those hoods that poke up behind its eyes, but you also have a mottled coloration pattern, which gives it its chocolate name, even though most chocolate doesn't have mottled patterns. But it does have a chocolate basic coloration, but it's a light tan and a dark brown, kind of, well, muddled together. And it's called mottled, M-O-T-T. Whenever you hear that description of a fish, that means it's not a distinct like stripes or leopard patterns. It's basically like you took two different colors, put it together, they didn't mix, they just got blobby around each other, and that's mottled. And so this has a mottled color pattern. A couple other notes about this guy. He does get nearly 12 inches in size, 10 to 12 inches, so you need a pretty big aquarium. These are juveniles. This guy right now, I'd call him 4.5 inches. They are considered algae eaters. It's good to have something like catnips from Sarah or Hikari algae wafers, along with, once in a while, I mean, he is a pet, you can give him a little treat. They like zucchini and cucumber. Be sure you use Persian cucumbers. I'm just kidding. He'll eat any cucumber. You cut a little slice, put a plant weight through it, and put it through your zucchini, drop it in the bottom, and just leave it there for a couple days, and he'll nibble on it, and you'll give him a nice treat. The easiest way is just add a couple prepared plant wafers. And then, of course, he eats algae and detritus and food that falls to the bottom. So he is omnivorous, but he prefers algae and other vegetarian diets. But don't consider him an algae eater. He's not going to keep your tank algae clean. Okay, so I have a Pleco. Again, they're one of my favorites, so I keep one in my own little play show tank here at the warehouse. So I have one that's been here a bit of time. So you'll see, it's actually a good example to see what a fish looks like basically when it comes from the wild, because they'll obviously be in a difficult environment. Often they have shredded fins, versus one that's in your aquarium, same species, same fish. He's slightly smaller, but he's been with us for a few months now. And this is a Rhino Pleco with all its fins fully in place without any biting from any other predator fish. So you can see the difference. Still has a mottled pattern and everything else that you would expect from a Rhino Pleco. And it looks a little bit more like a sailfin Pleco, I guess, in this way, but I still don't see how people confuse the two species. So let's go over the defining features of Pterygia scrophus. It's got the sailfin, and but unlike a sailfin Pleco, it also has hoods over its nostrils that protrude quite far, and that gives it a horn-like appearance, hence the common name rhino. But also because of its scaling, it's also called, especially on the base of its body, it's got some really defined scales that come out. It's also called an alligator Pleco, but I prefer to call it, personally, the Rhino Pleco. It's also called the chocolate Pleco. If you can call a Pleco a Rhino Pleco or an alligator Pleco, would you really call it a chocolate Pleco? So this is our distinct, amazing Rhino Pleco. One is fresh from the wild, and you can see it's been tattered a bit, the larger one, and that's for mosquito fish, most likely, that were in the pond this came from. And the other one has been in our little show tank here for quite a while, and that's a fully healed Rhino Pleco with its fins all grown back. It takes about 4 weeks for that to happen. So this guy on the top is not going to look, the larger one is not going to look like the smaller one with its fully healed fins for about a month. So don't despair though, it causes the fish no harm whatsoever. When I get fish right from Colombia or Peru, they often have fin damage, and it's hard to avoid when they're in the wild or in a pond with mosquito fish. I gotta tell you guys one bad thing about the Rhino Pleco. Besides that it gets very large, so it's not suitable for smaller aquariums. Hi, he's looking at me. So the Rhino Pleco loves to eat plants, so you can't have these guys in a planted aquarium. Most large Plecos will dig them up anyways and scatter them, but these guys not only dig them up, they'll eat them. So they'll go after even banana plants floating up on the top. Maybe Anubias is safe, but that's about it. The favorite plants for these guys are going to be things like Anacharis, stuff that's easy for them to just chew and digest. So if you want to feed them plants, just feed them some hornwort or Anacharis if you happen to be in a southern climate and can grab it from your pond. Otherwise, it gets to be a little expensive. In summary, what's good and what's bad about the Rhino Pleco? The bad's a real quick and short list. They eat your plants and they get real big. That's it. Pretty bad, actually. But the good is they're peaceful. They're predominantly algae eaters. They will eat quite a bit of algae. And they're omnivorous. They'll scavenge a lot of the food that could possibly pollute the tank on the bottom. They get along with all the other fish, but they're tough enough that you can put them in a tank with aggressive species. So they can adapt to any community tank or aggressive fish tank. And they look really, really cool. That's a better list than the bad list. So overall, it's a good Pleco. And when I was doing some quick research on the Rhino Pleco, I did see those strings about sailfin Plecos sometimes getting confused with Rhino Pleco. I have some wild sailfin Plecos I got in from Colombia, and I want to throw one in and just show you some of the differences. If you like the Rhino Pleco, then you should see our previous episode where we covered all kinds of different Plecos. And we can, since we're on the subject, we can just talk about some of the good and bad about sailfin Plecos. Pretend he's the same size. He's obviously a lot smaller, but that's not one of the differences I was going to talk about, because in fact, the sailfin pleco can get 2 feet long. It can become a massive pleco, similar to the Trinidad pleco, which I would put it on the not so good list. He's a scavenger, not as good an algae eater as the Rhino Pleco, and like the Rhino Pleco, he'll dig around and become very active, particularly at night, and dig up plants. He doesn't eat them like the Rhino Pleco, but he'll dig them up, stir them up. So not good for planted tanks. But they have a dorsal fin really similar to the Rhino Pleco, and they have tiny, tiny little nasal hoods, but nothing like the Rhino Pleco. No one will ever call his little nasal hoods horns. And this one happens to have a spotted pattern. And when you bring these fish in from the wild, they can have a marble pattern, which actually has a different L number, and a spotted's L001, marble's L83, but they're basically identical. And then you have patterns that are in between. But you don't get this mottled chocolate pattern like you do on the Rhino Pleco. So if you take the fact that the modeled pattern is unique and those horns are unique, it's going to be difficult to confuse the two. Both these fish have the exact same family name, pterygia, which means armored, basically weaponized wings, which is actually a really cool name. But the specific species name is Josellimeanus, Josellimeanus, and that's the spotted sailfin pleco. Not as cool as Scrophus, but a cool name just the same. Again, I don't know what that name means either. I looked that one up and couldn't find it. Anyways, that's in a nutshell sailfin pleco species. The good and the bad on the sailfin pleco. It's attractive. It comes in varied patterns similar to Trinidad plecos. Has a much higher dorsal fin, which is very, very attractive in the aquarium, but it outgrows most aquariums. Digs up plants. Not as good an algae eater. Not as peaceful with other species as the Rhino Pleco. But otherwise, you know, they do have a lot of similarities. But when you see them side by side, you're not going to confuse the two. The Rhino Plecos are prettier and probably about 3 times the price, but still within reason. I'd say retail, something like this guy would be around $49 versus a sailfin pleco, which would be half that cost. And if you have a chance to get a Rhino Pleco in your aquarium, if you have a large one, it doesn't matter what species you have, and just don't put them in a planted tank. You can buy these plecos. I know they have them in stock right now at aquariumfish.com. There may be a few local independent pet stores. You're not going to find them at a chain store. If you like the show, please like and subscribe. We hope to see you at the next show, where we're going to cover South American species of cichlids. If you don't have these plecos yet because you don't have a fish tank, get an aquarium.